Hi, and welcome back to another one of our online lectures here in World History. Today we're going to talk a little bit about India. Basically what we want to do here is we want to establish a little bit of the geography of India as well as looking at some of the early civilization. As you well know, in order to know who they are, we have to know where they are. So geography absolutely matters. So let's take a look at the two constructive response questions we will have for this lecture here today. First question says, describe the geography of the Indian subcontinent. And we're going to talk quite a bit about the geography, so we'll have a lot to use to answer that question. The second question says, trace the development and significance of the civilization that developed in the Indus River Valley. And we're going to look at that. We're going to look at the Harappan civilization. We'll look at some of their accomplishments and some of the things that really make them stand out as a civilization. So we should have enough to answer both those questions by the time we're done here today. So our roadmap of what we will learn looks like this. Like I said, we'll start with the geography of India. We'll talk about the Indus River Valley cultures, and then we'll briefly talk about the end of those Indus River Valley cultures. So that is what we will learn here today. So let's go ahead and set the stage here. Historians know less about the origins and eventual decline of the early Indian cultures because the language of that culture has not been translated yet. And this is sort of a rarity in history. When you look at hieroglyphics and you look at different languages that other cultures have used, we've always been able to find some type of commonality. You bring in the linguists and they really do their job, and they can find some type of correlation that they can then start translating the language. But that hasn't been done here yet. So we have to go off the artifacts and the physical clues that they left us. And there's a lot of those to tell us who they were. But we also have a lot of language out there that's just waiting to tell us more stories. And in a way, it's sort of sad that we don't know what it's saying. And maybe we never will. But hopefully someday that language will be cracked and we can learn so much more about who the people in early India were. So we're going to start with looking at the Indian subcontinent. India is really sort of interesting, as we're going to find out. The Indian subcontinent is really cut off by geography. I mean, you've got the Arabian Sea, you've got the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal, and you've got some of the tallest mountains in the world, the Himalayas and the Karakoram Mountains, the Hindu Kush, all kind of cutting India off in the north. So in a way, it's almost like out there on its own. So India gets this sort of distinction of having its own subcontinent. We know it's not its own continent, but in a way it almost could be the eighth continent on the planet if you really wanted to break it down that way. So we're going to look at this map several times, and we're going to point out several important landmass features that exist on it. So let's talk about the geography of the Indian subcontinent. India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh make up the landmass of the Indian subcontinent. Those countries have similarities in terms of customs and cultures and things, but they also have their differences as well. But they all share this Indian subcontinent. The region is separated from Asia by several mountain ranges. Some of them are the tallest in the world, and we're going to list those here. We've got the Hindu Kush Mountains, the Karakoram Mountains, and the Himalayas. The Himalayas are obviously very well known because that's where Mount Everest is, which is the tallest mountain in the world. So let's point those out for you. We look back at our map. Like I said, we're going to look at this map several times. So here we've got the Hindu Kush Mountains. Up here we've got the Karakoram Range. And over here we've got the Himalayas. All of those mountains were supposed to be labeled on your map assignment. So if you haven't labeled those yet, you can go ahead and take out your map and put that right on there so you have those mountain ranges taken care of. And again, India is very cut off in the north. You're not going to bring an invading army across the Himalaya mountains. It's not a good idea. You're not going to bring your invading army across any of these mountain ranges. So in a way, India is very safe in that regard. So rivers always matter. In this case, we're going to talk about two rivers. We're going to talk about the Indus River and the Ganges River. Just like in Egypt, we talked about the Nile, and in Mesopotamia, we talked about the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So in the Indus River, farming is only possible in the areas directly watered by the Indus. Because of the hills, because of some of the mountain ranges, it's a little bit difficult to get irrigation to where you need it. So you kind of have to be right along the Indus River itself. much of the lower Indus Valley is occupied by the Thar Desert. And this is kind of what makes India both beautiful and difficult to live in, because you've got deserts, you've got rivers, you've got these wonderful mountain ranges, but as we know, some of those places can be very difficult to live in. You don't typically want to live in the mountains because it makes farming difficult, and it can be cold and treacherous, and deserts, of course, don't provide you with much in terms of resources. So India is a nice place, but it can also lack some of the resources that you need for survival. Excuse me. The other river is the Ganges River, and the Ganges River flows from the Himalayas and flows actually across northern India. And of course, I'll show both of these to you on a map. But the interesting thing about the Ganges River is how sacred it is. It eventually joins the Brahmaputra River as it flows into the Bay of Bengal. But as you can see from these images here, a lot of people ritualistically bathe and cleanse themselves in the Ganges River because they see it as such a sacred river, which by Western standards is a little bit, I don't want to use the word disgusting because I certainly don't want to make fun of any culture here, but the river is very, very dirty and polluted, and a lot of it has to do with the animals that graze in it and certainly do their business in it. But it's just been a ritualistic thing for Indian culture for a very long time. So what you see here is not only people looking like they're doing their laundry, but they're ritualistically bathing in the river as part of their Hindu culture. So let's point out these rivers on the map here. We've got the Indus River over here. If you look carefully, you can see it flowing through this region. And then, of course, over here we have the Ganges River, which flows just like this, meets up with the Brahmaputra, and hits the Bay of Bengal. So if we look at this map, the best farming in India is way up in the north. So you've got the Thar Desert here, you can see that, but the rivers make this very, very nice piece of land that I'm going to talk about next as we continue on talking about the geography. So together these rivers make up a large area called the Indo-Gangetic Plain, which was great for agriculture, transportation, and irrigation. And we'll look at that again on the map, and it's obviously the best place for any civilization to have developed in India. They also have seasonal winds called monsoons, which dominate India's climate. And this is something you have to prepare for because they can certainly ruin crops and destroy homes. It's an environmental hazard of living in India, and I'll show you a couple images of this coming up. So some of the other environmental challenges in India, they have the yearly floods of the rivers. They're unpredictable, much like the Tigris and Euphrates. We talked about how the Nile was predictable, but here the rivers are not predictable, and that's obviously a problem. When it floods too much, you can destroy crops and homes. If it floods too little, you can lose lots of good farm silt and therefore maybe even starve. The interesting thing, because of the bedrock, the rivers sometimes change course. As you know, rivers can, with the current within them, can actually carve away. So if you spend enough time in one area, the river actually can move. And it's very, very slight, but it does matter if you are certainly building a large civilization or city along them. You have to understand that at one point that river might start moving in a direction or two. It's going to be very subtle, but it can happen. And of course, we mentioned those monsoons. Monsoons brought unpredictable cycles of wet and dry seasons. You want that rain, you want that water, but you didn't always know when it was going to come. You didn't know how much you were going to get, and certainly that could be an issue. So the Indo-Gangetic Plain you see here, it's labeled on this map. Again, it's that green area I was talking about previously. This is where some of the bigger cities are, Varanasi, New Delhi, and certainly the cities we're going to look at in the Harappan civilization in a minute here developed up in this region. Again, it's all along the rivers, so the Indo-Gangetic Plain is where the best farmland would have been found. Here's some pictures of the monsoons. You get a lot of water, you get these flash floods. They come on in, they kind of cycle through different parts of India. This is a map from a few years ago showing what time of year that they came through in that particular year. Again, they can be very unpredictable and can drop a lot of rain, or certainly can give you some dry season if there's not a lot of rain. If you expect more rain, you get less. That can be an issue for you as well. All right, so that covers the geography part of India. When we come back in part two, what we're going to look at is we're going to look at the earliest culture that developed there. We're going to call it the Harappan civilization. We're going to learn some pretty cool things that they did way before anybody else did. So go ahead and hit stop and cue up part two.